This episode is based on a video created by Naki and Vladimir Milov on the 3rd of June 2024. The title of their video is Tax Increases Will Hit Everyone, and it is about the double whammy hitting Russian businesses of inflation and tax hikes, which we've been following throughout the course of the month. This is a transcription of their dialogue from the Russian language, and it's been edited down into the core details that will be of interest to a Silicon Curtain audience. What has become clear about the Russian economy over the past week? Now we won't be able to tell how petrol production rates fell since it was defined as classified, which of course is a sure sign that everything is fine and under control. But also, this week, a lot of other things were happening. Let's start with gasoline because this situation is a complete joke. Last week, we saw the lowest level for the production of gasoline from diesel since February. All these attacks on Russian refineries by Ukraine, as we find out, actually have an impact. But the Russian government just stupidly decided to keep it all a secret, as they say, in order to prevent market manipulation by unscrupulous parties, whoever those may be. This classification of data on gasoline production indicates that they have big, irreparable problems. That is, apparently, they do not want people to see how seriously the Ukrainian strikes are knocking out all these Russian oil refining capacities and the impact they are having. In reaction, Lukoil has announced it's preparing to launch 6 more refining units and a cat cracking unit in June. Well, of course, they are going to somehow try to repair the damaged facilities, patch them up in any way they can. Nevertheless, it seems to me that this case is an indicator that the situation there is bad, with no real prospects for radical improvement. Therefore, they decided to simply stupidly act and classify the production statistics. The only way perhaps they could patch things up is if there was a big pause on these attacks on large refinery installations. But my sense is there will not be such a pause. The Ministry of Finance announced its package, almost 3 trillion rubles, money that they want to collect from the economy. Who would have expected this? Although personal income tax only accounts for around 20% of this tax package, it's estimated that 60% comes from tax increases on corporate profits. And this really is a very serious, a very problematic story. They want to raise 1.6 trillion rubles next year through an increase in income tax. Profits spent on investment, according to Rostat last year, were 14 trillion rubles. That is, roughly speaking, more than 10% of the profits raised going into investment. So they just want to grab that. They want to take it in the form of a tax. This will partly cause a rise in prices, partly a reduction in the investment process, and a shutdown of the economy. That seems obvious. There are also not very noticeable aspects of this announcement, but rather complex things hidden within the statistics. For example, the third largest factor and a component in this increase in tax is the sharp increase in taxes on small businesses. What do they want to achieve? On the one hand, they're increasing the threshold under the simplified taxation system, that is to 450 million turnover companies. It seems that it will be possible for slightly larger businesses to register on the simplified tax system, but at the same time, they start with a turnover of 60 million rubles. And in general, this is a really, really low threshold. But in the figures, there's something else. They have raised the bar further. They will now charge VAT on every business that is making more than 60 million rubles. That is a blatant increase in more than 300 billion rubles a year. And they want the burden to fall the payers of the simplified tax system with this additional tax. The Ministry of Finance explains this by saying that it is fighting the so-called division of companies. That's when a large business is split into several smaller ones in order to pay taxes as a simplified small business, but in fact they are components of one large business. Is this fair? So is this simply a measure to try and stop tax avoidance? No, this is a very strange explanation because this activity is already prohibited by law. Well, what is all this for? Is it that the money is running out? What is the real reason for such a tax increase? Well, one can argue this in different ways, whether it will hit businesses, whether it will hit consumers or not. But it seems to me that there is no tax increase that does not, one way or another, hit consumers. What's the reason for this? Well, the basic reason why this happens is because the government go after those who are defenseless, simply. They had a big discussion with big business. Big business has some clout. They agreed that, okay, let's transfer income tax rate. Let's hike it to 25%. They look at that. They think, can they get more? No, big business is not defenseless. They understand that attacking small business instead, defenseless businesses, is bad for the economy. But apparently they decided that's it. The economy can go in one place, but the main thing for us is to collect 1 trillion rubles. They just want to collect what's left on the table, target those who cannot defend themselves. And here are a couple of interesting side points on that. It means that they've also made alcohol used for the production of medicines an excisable product, something that can now accrue VAT. And now they want another 20 billion rubles for that. That is, they say there's some kind of large-scale production of illegal alcohol under the guise of medicine. Well, that's complete nonsense. They are clearly just once again looking for some areas where they simply will not meet resistance and can simply go there and raise additional money. Remember also, they promised for a long time to lure IT specialists back to the country. They said we would establish benefits for IT companies here, zero income tax, and that so-called zero income tax for IT specialists will now be 5% for IT companies. They're taxing the companies, they're taxing the employees. Also, everyone is waiting for the central bank to raise rates on June the 7th. That is, businesses hit by a kind of double woe. On the one hand, the government comes with taxes, and on the other hand, apparently, there will be an interest rate increase. But the point in this macroeconomic picture is that this will not be short term. The country will not get out of these super high rates for a long, long time. A few months ago, everyone was expecting the central bank would now quickly suppress inflation, and by the second half of the year would begin to lower the rate. Well, that's clearly not happened. Now taxes will also be increased on top of that, and the super high interest rates will remain for a long, long time. It is also interesting to note that this pessimism is growing so much that the Ministry of Finance, again, for the June the 29th auction, was unable to hold the auction for the placement of OFZs and cancelled it because the yields being asked were too high, because they were just simply too expensive for investors. That is, the market evaluates Russia's economic situation and the capabilities of the government worse and worse as the months go by. In the first 4 months of the year, the budget deficit amounted to apparently 1.5 trillion rubles. That is almost the same as the planned annual one. And that's in data from the Ministry of Finance. But new data came out from the Federal Treasury, which disputes this and suggests that actually the deficit was 4 trillion, not 1.5. This is completely different by an order of magnitude. Now many people are trying to explain and understand what is the reason for this discrepancy. The Ministry of Finance clearly has some kind of manipulations of the numbers they're going on. They're used to, for instance, maintaining a beautiful control deficit up until the end of December. But in reality, that probably hides a much, much larger deficit. And it's also quite possible, it's actually clear that these differentials in the numbers was some kind of long-term wholesale delivery of military products, apparently hidden within the numbers, rather than just being some kind of mathematical anomaly. Well, let's turn to military production, because that is returning to some kind of growth, but it is difficult for them to continue that growth rate at such a high pace as we saw last year. The only way they can do this is if they're able to get their hands on the electronic components required for the manufacturing. But on the other hand, let's see how that story runs with the freezing of electronic imports from China due to the fact that payments are still being blocked. That's something we covered in a past episode. In April, there was a strong slowdown in industrial growth of less than 4% in annual terms, much lower than in previous months. That is, miracles do not happen after all. You may have heard some beautiful, optimistic numbers, but these are not coming to pass. This was mainly due to the fact that in February and March, there were high deliveries for military product, but this is some kind of one-time story, and that does not create any great long-term prospects for the economy. Deputy Minister of Finance Kalichev made a very interesting statement that they could perhaps increase federal budget spending this year. My hypothesis is that Belousov, since he now has a mandate, as they say, to restore some kind of order, he will come together with Chemyzov with a collective request for more money, that is to increase the military budget even more, far beyond what it's already at. We also talked in the previous episode about Chemyzov, who has said that his military ventures have zero profitability under the current state of affairs. Well, whatever one may say, this means that the price tag his military outputs, his military products carry will have to increase. But the largest part of the budget is to cover personnel. And you see that even for a one-time payment of 1 million rubles, they're not finding enough people who are willing to serve as contract soldiers in Putin's army. This will mean that inevitably that monetary allowance to try and attract more soldiers to the army will also have to increase. There is, as you'll have seen in the media, some kind of hypothesis that Belousov can restore some kind of order by fighting production, by fighting corruption. But the supply budget that stands to gain the most from a reduction of corruption has a very small budget, less than 1 trillion rubles, for all the supplies for the entire army from Kaliningrad to Vladivostok. Well, it's clear that whether you fight corruption or don't fight corruption, you will simply need to pump a lot more money into this budget if you're going to affect any kind of change. I'm sure that is what awaits us now. In the coming months, we will see an announcement about an even stronger increase in the military budget, perhaps from 11 trillion to 15 trillion rubles and so on. Here we immediately begin to understand why they need to rush so quickly with these tax increases. There is a lot of discussion also about progressive personal income tax, which is increasing by 2 points. Well, the first thing to note, of course, is that this makes Russia look incredibly poor, even according to the official statistics. When the higher band of salaries are considered to be around, on average, $1,000 per month, that is according to the rhetoric. These are presented as high salary rates, and there are only around 3% of the population listed on receiving such salaries. This just demonstrates the scale of how poor Russia and individual Russians now are. And of course, this has changed dramatically with inflation. Just 5 years ago, in relative terms, that $1,000 a month salary would have been up at the $2,000 rate in terms of its purchasing power. And that's because, taking into account the increased price tag on consumer products that we've mentioned before, there has been a doubling of prices since the beginning of the full-scale war for basic consumer goods. Now, the West also has a progressive tax system. Well, yes, that developed historically. But note, within that system, the rich, really rich people, don't pay salary taxes. They receive income from property, and as a rule, taxes are extremely low. And that system works in the West. It works for the rich. They invest constantly in new businesses and the economy. They have a very complex system of deductions by which they reimburse themselves to generate tax. But in Russia, what is this apparent progressive personal income tax? Effectively, it's a tax not on the rich, it's a tax on skilled labor. But here, there's another thing. The main problem is the shortage of personnel. Shortages and more shortages, whatever sector you look at. With one hand and with the other, they begin to raise taxes on IT companies, and then they raise taxes on qualified salaries of specialists. It's obvious that the effect will be that many people in skilled professions will look abroad. For some reason, they think that if the IT people have returned, then that's it, the story's over, and they can milk them once again. Well, this is a very strange perception. And this is what I told many people who were considering returning to Russia after they initially fled in 2022, despite the fact that in Russia they are conditionally ready to pay them more or exempt them from taxes or give them preferences. I explained, look, now they are luring you in because they're faced with the fact they have problems, but they will cheat you anyway because the Putin regime always cheats everyone. The military, IT specialists, its own functionaries, everyone. It doesn't matter to him who he throws under the bus. He'll screw over absolutely everyone. And now we see that this is happening even faster than we can ever have imagined. And now all these golden promises that were made melting away right before our eyes. Therefore, I'm sure that all these measures combined will have a very bad effect indeed. The problems of shortages of qualified personnel will only intensify because of these tax changes. Now, the West is starting to move away a little bit from the point of view of not letting anyone in from Russia, and they're starting to understand that it is actually profitable to lure away qualified Russian personnel. Not all countries yet have realized this, but the awareness is slowly dawning. And we know that when the carrot doesn't work within the Russian system, or they run out of carrots, they start to use the stick. Therefore, until the whip begins to be used, now is the best time for qualified specialists to retrain, to become immigrants and build their careers abroad, having perhaps at first fewer resources and some hardships, but overall far greater stability. On the one hand, Russia has overcome the first shock of sanctions, and it seems that everything is not so bad. There is money for many people. On the other hand, they were promised so much more. And of course, there is inflation to consider as well. Everything overall, in my view, is going really badly. Last week, it was 8.1%. And now apparently moving to the point where the press headlines are saying that interest rates may be hiked to 18%, that banks are already starting to increase deposit rates ahead of that schedule. In fact, the market is already pricing in new increases. And it's even more important to note, as we said earlier, that this rate will have to be maintained for several years. That is, a consensus is being formed in this macroeconomic community that super high rates will last for a long, long time. Between this, the investment process is squeezed, taxes are raised, and we're also being told that affordable loans for businesses just won't be available. Many businesses assumed that rate would soon be reduced to 6 or 7% in the foreseeable annual period. If that were true, it would still somehow be possible for them to live there conditionally. But the general verdict is that at the higher rates, that is not an environment conducive to business. And overall, the picture here is that Russia is cutting off market mechanisms more and more, although it was those same market mechanisms that helped them to an extent to overcome the pressure of sanctions. And it seems to me that these measures taken together are not one big shot in the leg, but they amount to 1,000 small cuts to the legs of business. And we can only hope that eventually, cumulatively, these will all lead to the legs of the economy falling off. Well, let's quickly look at Elvira Nabiullina, the head of the central bank. Nabiullina, the new Chubais. Everyone, as far as I understand it, hates her in domestic Russian politics. The deputies in general, everyone throughout the system. The pressure from lobbyists is colossal to implement some kind of change of personnel. But the same Chimizov swears in an interview that we cannot take loans out if they're not directly subsidized by the state and not at those market interest rates that we mentioned before. Chimizov mentions the figure of 5%. So, of course, the pressure within the system to throw money at every problem is going to be enormous. And if we throw in more money amid this whole situation of a harsh inflationary background, yes, of course, the problems will grow even further. It's a kind of stalemate. It's impossible to raise the loans. It's impossible to lower the loans. The government seems to be caught between a rock and a hard place, and this is all as a consequence of the economic structure which Putin has created. Monopolistic, corrupt, opaque, which itself was initially built in order to control and increase prices. Russia has become dependent on China, where all industrial and consumer imports have risen sharply in price. This also contributes to inflation. There is the war, there is personnel shortages, and these are some of the main inflationary factors. That is, high inflation is a consequence of the basic model, this Putin's monopolized economy dependent on China, but also entirely hooked into the war. Just recently, Nabiullina was considered the main economic champion of Putin, who supported the Russian economy on her own shoulders, at least according to Western publications. Now she's becoming, just 6 months later, the main scapegoat, whose actions do not in any way help stop inflation, but at the same time kill business and market mechanisms in general. Well, in conclusion, let's hope that everything will fall apart there and they will all start pumping oil to the limit, prices will collapse, and that will all be great. As I was finishing this up, I wanted to say a few small things. Well, they are completely different to what we've been discussing, but they are nonetheless important. And this is to continue a topic we've covered before, and that is frontline regions. Gladkov, governor of the Belgorod region, has demanded that all payments related to the damage of property and health of people who refuse to be resettled from frontline regions be completely taken away. That is, again, this attitude towards people continuously surprises me. I'm not, I mean, I'm no longer amazed at anything from this government, but every time some part of their sheer brutality becomes apparent, my hair stands on end. That is, people live quietly, they had their own property, they were not connected in any way with the war. But of course, Putin started a war, which means you end up forcing them to disperse from the places where they'd lived for decades, and yet the blame is still placed on them. It still comes as a shock to me, but Russian authorities do this every single time. What am I talking about? Well, it's clear that these problems in the frontline regions will greatly worsen in the near future. That is, it's a complete black hole, a funnel that creates more and more large-scale difficulties. And another interesting story just to mention in conclusion, there was a massive glitch with the Uber delivery service. This is the largest courier company in Russia at this time. It's not clear whether this was a hacker or not. And related to this, evidence has been published that up to two-thirds of Russian companies are not protected in terms of cybersecurity because domestic solutions are really lousy in quality, as we know. Now, courier services for deliveries are very active in the market. It's become a big part of the economic model in large cities in Russia in recent years. But imagine if this same kind of hack were to strike other key industries, banks, for example, Russian railways, or something else, then it's entirely conceivable that these kind of regular failures from hacking attacks could get worse, could really scale up. Well, in the next report, there'll be a lot to cover. We'll be super busy. There's a meeting of the central bank on interest rates. There's new budget statistics from the Ministry of Finance for May. There are new statistics for April from Rostat and much more. So we will try to cover more financial topics in future episodes.